This presentation will cover the history of knitting, its relation to femininity, and my own attempt at knitting. The practice of turning thread into cloth is one of the most ancient in history, and though we do not know the very first instance of it precisely, due to its widespread nature very early on, a systemic standalone complex theory seems the most supported. That is to say, it didn't spread from one source, but developed independently in multiple cultures. Given this, a strange occurrence is the early predominance of women as its creator. In almost every ancient culture's mythology, they have a weaving god, and in almost every ancient culture, the god is female. This is evidence that the first weavers were female, and that very early on, it was dominated by women. But weaving isn't quite knitting. Knitting is somewhat different. An early form of pseudo-knitting, called null binding, has existed since at least 250 CE, when a fragment of such fabric was found in the ancient city of Dura Europus, along the Euphrates River in modern-day Syria. The first fragments of true knitting were found in Egypt from circa 1000 CE. They were socks of varied length and shades of white and indigo, with complex designs made out of cotton. From this we can extrapolate that knitting is probably a bit older than 1000 CE, due to the complexity of these earliest findings, but exactly how much older can't really be known. Knitting most likely originated out of the Middle East, and then spread into Europe via the Moorish conquests in Spain and incursions into France. Knitting didn't become widespread in Europe until the 14th century. Knitting was first widely done both by women and men, with the most technically proficient artisan knitters actually being male. The first European knitting was found in Spain circa 1250 CE, made by artisan male knitters for Prince Fernando de la Cerda. The first pearl stitches didn't appear until around mid-16th century though, again in Spain and again by men. Knitting continued to be pursued by both sexes into the 19th century in rural communities separated from urban centers, such as northern Scotland and its isles. But as most of Europe moved into the Industrial Revolution, knitting was shifted to the realm of non-working women, homemakers, upper-class wives, etc., as the cottage industry of the past was replaced by modern factories. Also, women and girls were employed mostly in textile industries due to their smaller hands, adding to the female bias in knitting, and cloth making in general. This early minor distinction over time became further and further bifurcated down the sex line, as the middle class grew, and the housewife population with it. Throughout the first half of the 20th century, knitting was considered the realm of stay-at-home parent, therefore women. This was accentuated by World War I, with a large amount of the male population from America in France fighting the Germans. The American population required more material than could be produced, and so encouraged women to pitch in. This included posters encouraging women to knit socks for our boys. In England during World War II, women were encouraged to knit balaclavas and gloves for the Royal Army and Navy. Balaclavas are more commonly known as ski masks, so this is more similar to something that was done in America during World War I. After World War II, as America transformed into its economic golden age, with the middle and upper classes exploding in size, brought a large increase in the amount of knitting that took place, mostly by housewives. Knitting, now for the first time, became a predominantly recreational activity, with a vast variety of different colors and textures of yarns being produced. As the 60s and 70s came about, though, knitting lost much of its popularity, as it became more and more associated with the sex of the 50s and history throughout beforehand. Knitting has recently seen a revival in the 21st century, though it is still predominantly done by women. Looking at the history of knitting, it is pretty easy to understand how it can be regarded as a feminine activity. With the bias towards females being the cloth makers in society, knitting simply followed the trend. even though in the beginning the ease of production led to both sexes participating. Most likely, the first master knitters were male due to the novelty of it early on, giving knitters a good deal of prestige and wealth. Though, as it became more commonplace, competitive males lost interest, while practical mothers and homemakers continued the practice. Throughout the literature provided by Rec. 3202, there is a trend, accurate or not, to portray females and the feminine perspective as one of caring, compassionate, and sacrificing. This characterization explains the female association with knitting. Knitting is the process of turning thread or yarn straight into clothing. This efficiency could be attractive to mothers trying to clothe their families in the spare time. This concept underlies why I had never considered knitting before. I don't have a family to clothe, and can buy much cheaper clothing at higher quality at any clothing store. Besides the obvious negative social association with a male knitting, I had no motivation or enticement to knit. In order to better understand knitting, though, I myself attempted to knit a small bag. I completed the bag out of brown yarn, which was sewn together on two sides using black yarn. I used a simple knitting pattern of interlocking loops in continued rows to create a loose fabric. I found the activity at first to be quite challenging, but got the pattern down quite quickly. Unfortunately, the speed at which I could knit stayed low, and so to just complete this simple bag took me 4+ hours. To be perfectly honest, I cannot find anything leisurely about the process. It's work. The motions are repetitive and quickly boring. Attempting to increase speed was somewhat entertaining, but only minimally. If this is to be considered leisure for women, then women must enjoy repetitive motions and find it, I suppose, relaxing to space out to. I suppose this could be similar to listening to techno music to space out for men, as it's both repetitive and somewhat agonizing to some. Overall, I did not enjoy knitting, and I would not participate in it again. The main reasons being that it was monotonous, antisocial, for me at least, being unable to concentrate on anything other than knitting the bag, and simply was painful to my fingers. This concludes my conversation about knitting. Thank you.